And we should be recording. And now, see if anybody signs in.
Excellent. Oh.
Hi, everybody. I see lots of folks signing on, which is very exciting. And we've got our speaker today, Sanders, here as well. If anybody's having trouble hearing either myself or Sanders as we go through today, you can either send a note in the chat box or put a question into the Q&A, and we'll see if there's much that we can do on our end. So I'm going to give folks a couple minutes to sign on. We'll get started. Turn things over to Sander.
Sounds good.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for signing in. I am Ezra Markowitz. I'm the current president of the Society for Environmental Population Conservation Psychology, Division 34 of the American Psychological Association. And I'm really excited to be able to launch this new webinar series for 2020. This is something new for the division. We haven't done this before, but I'm hoping that this will become a regular occurrence from here on out. And it's awesome to have so many people signed in already and huge interest in our first webinar, our first talk in the series. So because it's our first talk in the series, what I want to do is just very quickly introduce the idea behind the webinar and why we're doing this, where this came from. And then I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, who's going to kick off the full series for us, Sander van der Linden at the University of Cambridge. So we being the executive committee for the division, conceived of this idea of putting on a webinar series in 2020 around this broad idea of improving our science and increasing our impact. Because as we were taking a look around at the kinds of research and practice that were being done in our field last summer, as we all came together as a new executive committee in August, we realized that there's been a ton of interest and just rapidly increasing interest in our work and in our fields. Across the globe and across multiple sectors, not just within academia, but really quite a lot of interest in the applied realm as well. But at the same time, I think a lot of us have recognized a persistent and perhaps in some ways even growing gap between a lot of the research that's being done and some of the needs and real world problems that we all want to be addressing in our very applied field. And so, such was born the idea of this webinar series around improving our science and impact. So of course, that raises a big question. How do we actually improve our science? What do we do to increase the impact that we're having, the positive impact we're having in the world? And I think there were a couple of big ideas that came up. One was that there's more that we can be doing as a field to adopt best and improved practices in terms of the research and how we do our research, how we analyze our data, how we interpret what it is that we're finding, particularly for the researchers within our community. And there are lots of ways that we can do that and that we're going to focus on throughout this webinar series, things like incorporating mixed methods research designs, kind of an updated and more appropriate approach to statistical analysis writ large. There's been a lot of changes in the applied psych domain over the last decade or so. And I think our field needs to do some catch up. And so I think maybe we'll hear about a little bit of that from Sandra today, but we'll also have some sessions later on in the year dedicated specifically to kind of 21st century approaches to statistics. And I think there's also a lot that we can do to be pursuing a more robust science of applied psychology. And I'm hoping Sandra will speak to some of the efforts that he's been doing, very concrete efforts at the Journal of Environmental Psychology, specifically in that direction. The other thing that we've identified as a way that we can really improve our science is, and especially to increase our impact, is to better align the work that we're doing with the real world problems that we're trying to address. And that means we need to do things like working closely with practitioners and advocates on the ground, with policymakers, both within and beyond the green organization space. There continues to be this persistent gap between research and practical application, and we need to be working to close that. And I think there's some kind of bigger picture thinking that we need to do as well to take a step back to recognize both our strengths and weaknesses as a field that has some practical advice to give, but also to recognize where we fit in the larger kind of ecosystem of efforts towards improving the relationships between humans and the natural world and the social systems in which we're embedded. So we'll have a set of sessions later on throughout the year also focused on those types of issues. So I'm really excited about the webinar series. Just to give you a little bit of taste of what's coming up, in February, we'll hear from Sonia Sachdeva, who's embedded with the US Forest Service on mixed methods research. In March, from Ruben Sussman, who is a behavioral scientist who works at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, on how we translate some of our research into effective application within that applied space. In April, from Linda Selka, who's at University of Maine, talking about community engaged research and scholarship. In May, from Adam Corner, who runs climate outreach, on some of what the needs are from the practitioner side from our field. And in June, from Christian Klockner and Erica Lofstrom from NUST, talking a little bit more specifically about a topic they've been working on a lot around disruptive communication. And then as we kind of work out the details for July through December, we'll post all of that. So last thing I just want to say before I turn things over to Sander is that we have a lot of folks on the call today and who are registered who are already members of the society, and that's great. If you're not, I hope you'll consider joining it. You do not need to be in North America or based in the US to become a member of Division 34, and also you do not need to be a member of APA. So joining the society is very cheap as opposed to joining APA. And so I hope you'll consider that. If you're interested, you can email myself. You can always email our membership chair, Nancy Petrovsky. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our speaker for today, Sander van der Linden. He's an assistant professor at the University of Cambridge and also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Environmental Psychology, where he's been for, I think, a little bit over a year at this point in the EIC role. And I think making some awesome strides towards improving the robustness of our science. And so I asked him to talk about some of the concrete steps that we can all be taking towards a more robust science of environmental psychology. And I'm really excited to have him here today. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sander. And Sander, go for it.
Awesome. Should I share my screen again?
Yeah.
Here we go. Webinar. Perfect. Well, first of all, Ezra, thanks so much for having me on the webinar. Thanks everyone for taking valuable time. Whether it's the middle of the night in Australia, some people have pointed out to us, or your lunch break for tuning into this. I should say that I'm happy to lay out sort of our vision and what we've done But I realize, we don't have all the answers. We're not perfect. We're just trying to do our best towards making the best we can out of the journal, especially with an eye towards robust and reproducible environmental psychology. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that in the next few minutes. But I just wanted to preface saying that I have my biases in terms of what I think is good science and what the literature says, and lots of people have different opinions on this. I'm very happy to have a discussion, and a lot of these new ideas are up for discussion. For those of you who don't know the Journal of Environmental Psychology, I just want to do a quick introduction so everyone kind of knows the journal. Even if you do know the journal, we've changed a few things since I took over. So I just want to outline those, give you some stats. Some of these stats are usually things we share with the editorial board, but I picked out a few things that I think are okay to highlight. So the journal was established in 1980 by David Cantor, who was actually an architectural psychologist who then went into geographic profiling of criminals and looking at the role of the environment early on. We actually still have a focus on architectural psychology and the built environment. If you don't publish in a certain area, sometimes you're not aware of the full sort of breadth of the journal. But having been editor, as Ezra said, for a little over a year now, I've appreciated the wide range of submissions we get, which I think is both a blessing and a curse to deal with that kind of diversity. But it is a strength of the journal. Then Bob Gifford, ran the journal for 14 years, and Florian Kaiser and Jeff Jorman took over shortly after that, who've implemented a number of changes that I think were great and have sustained, and some things that we've also changed. The mission of the journal is still pretty much the same. We're looking at the interrelationships between people and their surroundings. But instead of built and natural environment, I've tried to extend the focus. We're also looking at social environments, and even when we're in a place, we're interacting with other people. We're increasingly talking about virtual environments, online environments. So I really wanted to expand the scope of how we conceptualize the idea of the environment, that it's not just built and natural anymore, but includes, virtual, social, online, all sorts of environments. What I think is different at the Journal of Environmental Psychology, certainly as a reviewer, when I was on the board and in submitting my own manuscripts, is that there is a unique focus on advancing the field of environmental psychology as a subdiscipline of its own. And so we still welcome contributions on all human-environment interactions, broadly construed, but there's a few themes, and the journal, I'm not sure if you've noticed this, but every few years or so, there's different groupings of the kind of themes that the journal publishes, and I've tried to restrict that to just three broad themes, which are place attachment, and Lila Scannell is the associate editor for that area mostly, and I think she took over from Maria Luica, who was at the journal for a number of years. And then we have built environments, and Lindsay McCunn is, who's also based in Canada, who took over Harry Heft's role, who was with the journal for a long time. And then Mark Ferguson, who's recently taken over the pro-environmental behavior, sustainability, nature, connection, well-being type of work from Tiziano Milfund, who also was with the journal for a number of years, and he's put in a lot of work also at environment and behavior, but ultimately, we're just getting to the point where there's so much editorial work that it's a bit overwhelming, which as editor-in-chief, I can keenly understand now. But we have three fantastic editors for these three broad areas. I also handle lots of manuscripts myself in all of those areas, which is both interesting just to learn about new stuff, and of course the areas that I work on myself too. And one thing that we do in the editorial office is that we do talk about manuscripts. We have conversations. I'm not micromanaging my editors, so they have independent, editorial decision power. So all editors make their own decisions. But sometimes we confer on manuscripts. Sometimes there is room for disagreement, and it's a very sort of collaborative environment. And so the focus is on a common editorial vision. rather than silos of sort of different disciplines. And I found in the year that we've been editing together that we share a lot of ideas, and sometimes different editors have different kinds of expertise, which I think is hugely valuable in judging the value of different kinds of manuscripts. So that's been great. The impact factor has been growing steadily. We're at 3.6 now, 5.9 for the 5-year. Which, when you compare that to a lot of social psych journals, it's actually much higher than a lot of, middle tier social psychology journals. So I think that's quite good. The journal is published in affiliation with the International Association for Applied Psychology, but Ezra and I have been conversing. I think it's great to actually do more with the division 34 environmental psychology as well, just because so many of the members are either on our board or submitting work to our journal. So I think there's room for increased interaction. So what kind of stuff gets published in the journal? If you're not that familiar with it, this is a combination of downloads. So the most popular downloads, as well as articles that are highly cited. But as you can see, it's these 3 areas that are recurring. So place attachment is very popular. And then we have, our work on pro-environmental behavior. John Zelensky's, cooperation is in our nature is a popular article about nature exposure. Then, green identity, pro-environmental behavior, but also the workspace and the built environment. So it does cover the whole range. And we have several, articles that are really popular in that area. But this is just a snapshot just to give people an idea. What's interesting, I think, for JAP compared to other journals is that most of our submissions come from Europe. We have a very strong environmental psychology base here in Europe. And one of the things I want to work on is a greater diversity of submissions from other areas of the world, including North America. That's our 3rd sort of most submitting country, so we do get a fair amount of submissions from North America, but not as much as from Asia or Europe. We just don't get a lot of submissions from the South and other places. So that's something that we want to work on and encourage authors from other parts of the world to submit to. Just to give you an idea of what I hope to do is sort of with this webinar is also give people some insights into the editorial process. When I was nudging editors about the status of my manuscript, and by all means do nudge me. I'm not one of those editors who gets annoyed when people nudge me about the status of the manuscripts. I do it because I want to get timely decisions and move on with my life. And I appreciate that other authors want that too. The thing is that you deal with so many manuscripts, you have your professional life, everything's going on. I actually appreciate reminders, authors checking in. So it should be should be careful about advertising this too much. But feel free to check in. But here's a chart of how many reviewers we invite on a monthly basis. So we invite over 100 reviewers a month to review for JAP. We get so many manuscripts that it takes over 100 reviewers. And so we really value our board, because part of the deal of being on the board is that you review for the journal, so that we get people reviewing manuscripts who are actually in the field and in the know about their respective areas. If you want to join the board, please feel free to contact me. That's always something we're happy to discuss. The agreement rate is about 50%. So about 50% of invites accept, which is complicated because at JAP we require usually a minimum of 3 reviews. I found that that's useful. I think that's been a standard that's been around. Sometimes it's 2 just because we can't get 3 reviewers, but ultimately I think all of the editors prefer to have 3 reviews just because you get a better overview, and it helps them balancing things out. Every reviewer has their own biases and their own perspective, so it just helps bias things out. But it's a huge number of reviews that we're dealing with. So if you look at the rejection rate, so the overall rejection rate of the journal is quite high now. I think Jeff and Florian, when they were co-editors of the journal in the years before, they've increased the desk reject rate, which I think we've maintained and strengthened further. So these are monthly figures. So if you look at the grand total, this year I got 700 manuscripts to deal with, 700, which is 57 manuscripts a month. So that comes down to about 10 emails a week that I get from new manuscripts, and some of those are dealt with the associate editors, but a lot of that I have to read and make decisions on, and I try to do it as fast as I can, but also want to give everyone, fair consideration. So what happens here is that it's just a high amount. The overall rejection rate is 85%. Only 15% of manuscripts eventually get accepted. I think the reason is that, first, I'll go into that more, but I think we get a lot of work that's either just not relevant or not up to the standards of what we now like to see. We tried to communicate this on the website and in the submission system, but somehow it doesn't seem to land in terms of what the criteria are. So I think that's also a great way, this webinar, to get the word out. Here's the rejection rate since 2014. So Bob Gifford had a different editorial strategy. There were also much, the submissions were fewer back in those days. And then, now we're almost at 70% desk reject rate. Outhand, because the manuscripts are not meeting the new standards for the field, and I think that's quite concerning. The amount of manuscripts that I read where I have concerns, I just think it's that has really opened my eyes to how big the problem sort of is in the field. I was kind of aware of it. I'm not particularly part of the, I don't self-identify as the methods police or the replication movement in what some people consider to be the extreme end of things, but I think do have a healthy outlook on the need of improving our science and figuring out ways of doing that. So there's an editorial you can read that I wrote that lays out the mission and some of the things that I'll be talking about here as well. So before I go into the reproducibility end, I just wanted to give you our new submission formats. We encourage reviews. We get a lot of reviews. For some reason, we get a lot of review articles. We don't publish narrative reviews anymore. I've stopped that. I think they're highly subjective. I welcome discussion on it. I think a better place for that is a perspective, like Nature Climate Change does, or some of the other journals where you have an opinionated perspective. I think that's a much better outlet for that kind of work. We do systematic reviews. A lot of the reviews we get are poor quality. We like to see people follow the PRISMA protocol, which is very clear, and I've shown the chart here on the right. Systematic ways of identifying your search criteria. What are the keys? What are the keywords? What are the key terms? And if you're one of those people who's already familiar with this and you kind of know what it's about, that's great. But you'd be surprised by how many people don't follow systematic protocols. What's the screening criteria? Is it experiments, observational? How many do you exclude? What's the final sample size? To have everything systematically laid out in a protocol, that's what we like to see for systematic reviews to really improve the robustness of our field. Because just doing more narrative reviews, more subjective stories of what we think are interesting studies is actually not shedding any light on how many studies meet the criteria of unbiasedness and generalizability. So PRISMA, has scores for, did the study, adjust for covariates when needed, or without covariates? Was it randomized? Was there a control group? Were the DVs validated? And then you get these sort of risk of bias sort of graphs that show you, what the state of a particular field or subfield is, and how bad the science is, more or less, and publication bias, file drawer effects, all these sort of things. So I'm keen to have more systematic reviews or meta-analyses. Again, meta-analyses, I'm encouraging them. We also receive a lot of poor quality meta-analysis that don't follow systematic searches. Have you contacted authors that might have data but don't have published manuscripts, right? Have you tried different countries? Have you tried, recording the search term, multiple databases? There's just so much ambiguity and unclarity in a lot of meta-analyses that it's not necessarily helping. Garbage in, garbage out, as they say. So that's something we're paying attention to. Letters to the editor, which I think Florian and Jeff added, which I appreciate. I kind of expanded the focus to opinion, correspondence, errors. We didn't have a debate, sort of an outlet before where people can just write to us with their thoughts. So that's kind of what I'm using it for. Brief empirical reports. Now, this is interesting because most people and most board members tend to think of the traditional JAP article as a full-length article. Traditionally, I think JAP is very heavy on theory, which I appreciate. It's a theory-focused journal. A lot of the desk rejections actually arise out of the fact that the studies are not advancing any theories in environmental psychology, not engaging with any established theories in environmental psychology, or not advancing any theoretical insights. And so, you know, for a journal that really appreciates applied work too, it's also quite theoretical, more so, perhaps more so than other journals. And those typically tend to be multi-study papers. So now 90% of the traditional article will be multi-study papers. I don't really publish single study papers anymore. I'm not of the JPSP kind where I think that the ideal article has 5, you know, studies. Because, you know, if you have 5 crappy studies, you're just compounding the problem. So that's not necessarily my view. But I would like to see conceptual replication of findings, which you can do in multi-study papers. So instead of that, we've now offered this sort of idea of brief reports. People have mixed feelings about this, you know, the rise of short reports in psychology and so on. We don't think it should go at the cost of quality, not at all. So, you know, the empirical findings need to be clear and straightforward. You know, it's a short report, so you can't submit messy, noisy data that's going to be complicated to explain. That's not a good format. You know, people think, oh, you know, this manuscript's not so good, or, you know, this is a bit complicated. I'm going to try to, you know, submit this as a short report. That's not the idea. The idea is you have a finding. It's clear, very transparent, solid result. Still theory-driven, but you don't need as much theory. Maybe it's a bit more incremental. Maybe it's, you know, just a nice finding, and that's fine. That's a good outlet for that kind of work. We're still exploring novel, provocative results in that section. So sometimes to aid the adjustment process, what we've done now is pivot manuscripts that were either in the pipeline for a long time or, you know, have interesting results. A new kind of field study was super intensive, you know, where we think readers could still learn something from this or take something nice away from the study, even though it's imperfect. We can think about, you know, whether that might be an empirical sort of report where, you know, it could find a home there. So we're keeping it somewhat flexible. People have mixed feelings about this idea of, you know, novel, provocative findings. I totally agree. We don't really hunt for novel findings. We're not looking for surprising findings. We're looking for robust findings. But sometimes you have something interesting to say, even though it was noisy. And so that we appreciate. You still need to have detailed supplements for short reports, technical appendix. You know, you still need to report all of the detail. You know, similar to Nature Climate Change or Nature Sustainability, where, you know, you have 5,000 words, but you might have a 10-page supplement explaining all of the stuff. Review times, we try to be short with short reports. You know, reviewers more likely to review it and they review it faster because it's shorter, but we can't guarantee shorter review times for that. Another new thing that I'm excited about sharing is a new section called Replication Reports. And I kind of want to preempt the replication crisis in environmental psychology. So I think it's inevitable. People are going to start looking at our findings and are the major findings in our field, how robust, how replicable are they? And I'm not sure how we're going to come out of that. So what I want to do is start replicating major findings in our field. You know, I don't care if it was a psychiatric ward in the 1960s in a prison where you find that, you know, having a window to nature aids recovery time, or whether it's a study about climate change cognition. There's 2 criteria. One is that it has to be a key finding in our field, or 2, a study that has been published in JAP. And it's about 5,000 words, doesn't need to be lengthy. And yeah, I think there's just a huge need for it. I put up a study here that I found in Nature Communications, meta-analysis of randomized control studies of behavioral interventions to promote household action on climate change. Now, admittedly, climate change is one of my interests that I'm also keen to promote more engagement with in the journal. But shockingly, the finding is that the average effect size was 0.09 D, Cohen's D of 0.09 for the average intervention, only for the duration of the intervention across all RCTs in that area. You know, that's just, that's not very encouraging. You know, we get tons of submissions about nature exposure. You know, we get it. Being out in nature makes people feel good. But what's really lacking is large randomized controlled trials of the effects of nature on human memory, cognition, well-being, and physiological function, for example. And so I'm really keen to have people replicate these findings and submit to this section. Now, our focus is on building a cumulative and robust science, having a conversation with the initial research and replication effort. And I've been personally quite involved in this debate in scholarly, as some of you might know, in scholarly disagreements with other people in our field and back and forths. And what I am bothered by the trolling that takes place online, the targeting of individuals, in fact, often female researchers. In some of the scandals that have come out, there's a disproportionate amount of targeting, which I find peculiar. And there's just a lot of negative sentiment around replication. So I really want to flip that on its head. It's supposed to be a positive section. I will always give the target authors an opportunity to respond to the replication effort if they want to have a two-way conversation, to have a debate, to make replications the norm. So your finding doesn't replicate, who cares? Not everything's going to replicate. That's a given. And so it doesn't have to be anyone's fault. That's just the way it is. But somebody replicates it, and now we know more than we knew before. A very interesting study came out in JDM, actually. When the general public gets two studies and one finding replicates and the other doesn't, people get more confused and think we know less. Well, from a stats perspective, you actually know more because you have more data. But what's interesting is that people seem to process this as contradictory results as somehow ending up knowing less, while theoretically we actually know more. So I'm really interested in this aspect. So I police these reports quite heavily on tone. No ad hominem attacks, no finger pointing. I want it to be a constructive, positive section for engaging with a better science, because I think ultimately that's going to be a better approach. So clear norms of engagement. We're still forming this sort of section. And so there's room for improvement on unanswered questions. Pre-registration, do you need to pre-register your replication? It's valued, it's welcome. We're not mandating it at this point. We do like people to be clear about, is it a direct replication or a conceptual replication? And so, it's in development. But we've gotten a few submissions of some big findings in our field. I'm really excited about it. The original authors were really engaged with the debate. And everyone's going to come out knowing more, I think, and it's going to be exciting. I'm stealing this from Bob Gifford's Dragons of Inaction. If you know this famous article in American Psychologist, what I will call the Dragons of Irreproducibility. That personally, having seen over 1,000 manuscripts, probably over 2,000 manuscripts in just the last year, what my personal bias is towards what I think is really the problem here. And I'd love to have discussions about that, but to sort of explain the desk rejection rate and the high rate at which we're rejecting manuscripts, these are the dragons of what I think is an irreproducible and problematic science. Sample size and power. It's astonishing how few manuscripts include power analysis. It's just so basic. And it's still lacking a priori power. Now, to ease the transition, and I've been doing this for over a year, I've allowed statements on how sample size was determined as an alternative for a priori power. Because again, we don't want to be extreme about anything, but we're encouraging a trend. And, I want people to be honest. And it's fine if, if you didn't think about it. I think people think, and especially authors think, they're less likely to get published if they're honest about the fact that they didn't think about power. Or that they just winged it with the sample size, or they went with however many students were available. That's fine. I'd rather have people be honest about that, and that the reader knows, okay, well, so they went out and and they got 100 students because that's what was available. Then the reader can interpret that and make of the finding what they will. What bothers me is when people are trying to hide this, and in the process of uncovering, and this is costing a lot of my time to converse with authors about the statement and where it's coming from. There's a process, a very uncomfortable process of trying to pull out the real story of the data. And this, 4 or 5 emails, resubmissions, and so it's unnecessarily complex. So we'd like to see a priori power analyses. Even it's redundant. You're doing a survey with 1,000 people. Why do you need a power analysis? Just do it. It's good practice. People like to read about it. You know you're well powered, and you can point to the power analysis and say you're way overpowered, which can also be a problem, but less of a problem to me than underpowered. Lack of sensitivity analyses. So you have a statement on how your sample size was determined. Great. Maybe everyone agrees post hoc power is not useful, but we can still do sensitivity analyses. What, given your sample size, what is the lowest effect that you could have detected with your sample, and what did you observe? And it helps interpret the findings in terms of how sensitive. What's your sensitivity rate for actually detecting the effects given your sample? What would the effect size have been? So that's still a useful exercise to do. Lack of representativeness of samples, it's sometimes less important for experiments, but not if the experiment is about ideology or wanting to generalize to a population. But especially for surveys, diverse representative samples. We're a top journal. We just can't, it's just not enough anymore to base findings that are common in the literature on student samples or other samples that are just not representative of the population. And so, I'm putting 2 notes here at the end to questions we get, and these are the answers. That yes, context matters for sample size. We know that. We know that sometimes it's difficult to get a large sample. If you're doing a big field study, it's difficult. If you're doing interviews, we do understand that. And we know resources are finite. We try not to disadvantage researchers who might have less resources than people at other institutes. But there are some general sort of basic standards for quality. How is the sample selected? How much bias is there in the selection of the sample? Is the sample just too small to generalize as a general point? Or sometimes all of the above, and that just makes it difficult to do anything with the manuscript if it's suffering from all of these issues. Matt Goldberg published a paper in our journal, How Often Does Random Assignment Fail? Which is, we went through a very interesting process. So he's, and I want to share this with you, he's simulating, this is for experimental data, he's simulating the standardized differences between treatment and control groups after random assignment. So, we all assume that, okay, well, we did a randomized experiment, so our groups are going to be similar on average. But that isn't true when you have small samples. So this is also why sample size matters. And so here he's plotting for Cohen's D of 0.2, 0.3, and 0.4, the percentage of time that there still will be significant between group differences on pre-measures, whether it's familiarity with a message or ideology or age or other sort of pre-characteristics for a given sample size. So you see here, at 700, it's very unlikely that you will have unequal groups based on pre-treatment characteristics. But at 50 and 100, there's huge potential for the groups to be unbalanced on these key characteristics. And these are typical sample sizes in social psychology, 200 to 250 for an experiment. So we are actively thinking about this and are asking authors to engage with these issues. One thing I'm personally, very attuned to is exclusions in covariate adjustment. Lack of reporting around main effects, lack of reporting without covariates. If your treatment is only there effect when you include covariates, that's an important limitation. Exclusion criteria are subjective. We all know that. I personally don't really believe in exclusion criteria unless you pre-register them or you can show that they're really implausible values for the data or somebody was just making stuff up. Other than that, it's just all subjective. And so what we like to do, the simple solution to this is just report your analyses and report them again without any exclusions. And again, people are worried that the results are going to change and the manuscript is not going to get published. That's not the purpose. The purpose is report both so that it's transparent for the reader. Okay, so turns out your results are only there, when you do your exclusions. Well, that's important for the reader to know. I'm not going to punish people for being honest and transparent because I think that sends the wrong incentive. Even though as an editor you might say, okay, well, then actually this manuscript isn't as good as we thought it was. But I'm thinking, it's better to just publish it and let the reader decide. But at least now we know what's going on. Covariates. People introduce covariates without strong theoretical arguments for why they should be there. This is another one of those things. So yeah, covariates can increase precision of the treatment effect sometimes, and yes, some data is just bad, and we know that. But overall, these are some of the things that we're looking at. Mediation and moderation, another huge topic. There's so many opinions on this. We're not going to pretend that we have the best strategy. But a new paper recently came out showing that most interactions are underpowered and sample dependent, meaning they don't generalize. I think this is a huge problem. And I think it's because of overfitting. So when you have a smallest sample, you find your interaction. What are the chances it's going to replicate on an independent sample? Turns out the probability of that is very low. Because the interaction effect tends to be highly sample dependent. And I think this is a huge issue because people love interactions and heterogeneity and different, especially in my area in climate change, sort of psychology, people are like, oh, conservatives this, liberals that, oh, these people this, these people that, we need to have theories of why different groups do different things. And I think that's all fine, but a lot of interactions actually are just not reliable. And they don't uncover heterogeneity to the extent that we think it does. And so I'm really scrutinizing interactions. And they need to be included in the power analysis. This is the number 1 thing. So I say, hey, I included my power analysis. But then you're doing 2- and 3-way interactions that were not part of the power analysis. And that's why the power analysis is even more important. If you have a sample of 200 students, don't do the interaction if it wasn't power for that. We don't need to, or label them as exploratory. So now sometimes, what I find acceptable is if we label things as exploratory. When we probe the interaction, it was totally exploratory. We don't know if this is going to replicate, but it's in our data. Make what you will out of it. I think that's a better approach than pretending that there's this great value in interactions, while in fact, often they're not. We know in psychology, manuscripts that are based around 3-way interactions, they're a huge problem because you need so much power for a 3-way interaction. So Gelman calculated that, on average, an interaction takes about 16 times the sample of a main effect. So the difference is huge for an interaction in sampling requirements, and especially for 3-way interactions. So think about this. So when I'm looking at a 3-way interaction, I'm breaking this down in my head. How many people are in the cell? You're looking at female, educated, liberals. How many are in that group from your sample of 200? 10 people, right? So we're talking about 10 people. That's just not reliable science. And so I think we should stay away from doing that unless we have a sample of 6,000 people, or that's properly powered for that kind of stuff. So I do have some strong opinions on it, but I try to be flexible in this transition and getting authors to think and reflect about it. Theory, if you don't have a theory for an interaction, what's the point of running it? It's just more multiple testing. Mediation, I do a lot of mediation. I think there's concerns about this. We really prefer structural equation modeling. I'm personally not really a big fan of the Hayes macro. I hope he's not on this call. But the process macro, just because it's inefficient. You're estimating multiple mediation models separately, while you could all do it within a structural equation modeling framework and model the measurement error at the same time. Do maximum likelihood, correct for non-normality, bootstrapping. You can all do that within structural equation modeling. So we try to encourage authors to if you're going to do mediation, try to do it the detailed way, in a way that allows for funky patterns in the data and correcting for that. It's not great in observational data. We know that. So what I like to do is to have people reflect on the strength of the mediational evidence. I don't want to ban mediation. I don't think that's necessary at all. But I think it's important we reflect on the strength of the mediation analysis. Is it done in observational data? That's not very strong. So we should report that and say, well, there could be 1,000 other mediators not included. It's not strong evidence of a mechanism, but there's something there. Even on experimental data, that's better, but there's still no causal chain. Very few causal chain experiments where we try to manipulate, basically every step of the mediational chain separately. It's very difficult to do. So I'm not expecting, including in my own research, I'm not expecting people to sort of start doing that all of a sudden. But I'd like to encourage a shift of thinking away from, doing mediation on everything, and think about multiple mediators. What about reversing the mediation, right? There's lots of interesting things we can do as robustness checks with mediation that help tell a more accurate story. Because I think in psychology, we're all obsessed with mechanisms, and just, anything could be a mechanism. It's just so difficult to establish it. So I think we need to scrutinize that more. Ezra was talking about, applied science. I do think another issue is lack of meaningful effects of small effects and outcome measures, not behavior or decision making. I think Wes Schultz has this article called "Conservation Means Behavior." I think at JP, I'm interested in non-behavioral processes, but I recognize that part of the issue with reproducibility is that processes are actually very difficult to replicate mechanistic things. Well, as behavior, it occurs, and if it's real, you should be able to replicate it fairly easily if it's not too contextual. And so I like the idea of having behavioral outcome measures in decision-making, having concrete outcome measures whenever we can. We're reducing the amount of intention-only work and proxies for decision-making. If you have 3 experiments but not a single behavioral measure, it's unlikely to get through. Because I think we just need at least some measures that are actually relevant to how people make decisions in the real world. A lot of DV measures are just not reliable. People are using DVs that have poor measurement characteristics, poor construct validity, very noisy, and small effects. So I'm not one of those people who says small effects are useless, but they are without interpretation of what the effect, without contextual understanding of why this small effect is relevant to what you're studying. And so again, no measure is perfect. Small effects can be meaningful, and antecedents are important too. But that's kind of the things that we're looking at. Multiple testing. This is an obvious one. I'm not spend too much on that. But we get manuscripts. Here's 50 regression models. People think about multiple testing often in terms of one test and how many corrections, how many post hocs you're doing. But if you're doing 10 regressions, 3 ANOVAs, and 4 t-tests, you're not thinking between in terms of how many tests you're actually doing that is compounding the false positive rate. Yeah, you can argue that these are independent tests, and to some extent, it really depends on the data if things are really independent. But for better or worse, I think we need to reduce the amount of multiple testing to reduce probability of false positives in our field. And people, it's wild the amount of testing that people do. And I'm trying to encourage stronger theoretical assumptions, less testing, less probing of the data. And the last one, my last dragon of reproducibility, is poor reporting standards. This is a major issue with the desk reject. Pre-registration, again, it's not mandatory. It is valued. No a priori hypotheses, no advancing sort of treatment. Treatment materials not included. Survey instrument not included. Data isn't deposited. You can, it's not mandatory, but we do appreciate people depositing data. No effect sizes are reported. No transparency about uncertainty in the data. You read the manuscript, and it's not, as Ezra said, not in 21st century reporting standards. And we do appreciate that people have been doing the studies the way they've been doing the studies for a long time. Standards have changed. People who were doing studies in the 70s might have a very different view of what the standards were, or should be. And they're changing, and I think we're allowing for this transition period to not be too extreme about it, but we encourage authors to change these standards. We have been doing that actively for the last year. It takes a lot of time, so we're hoping that we're now moving closer to not having to do that. Because it's just a potent cocktail. Most of the rejects are, I'm reading a manuscript, you're only showing me covariates in your analyses. You're doing tons of statistical tests, no corrections. It was a small sample, don't know where it's coming from, underpowered, 3-way interactions, moderated mediation, but I don't even think about how big of a sample you need for moderated mediation. No treatment materials, that's just, it's just a desk reject. Because the thing is, with 700 manuscripts, we just have to be extremely selective of advancing it through the next stage, and we can't help everyone. If there's too many problems, we just desk reject it with some quick comments on all the things that are wrong with it, but we can't help everyone get to the level of where we need to be for a lot of this work. So I talked a lot, and I'm going to end shortly here, because I want to have room for discussion. I talked a lot about quantitative stuff. We welcome qualitative research. And I should say the same applies there. You know, people send us emails, oh, you know, but qualitative research is not subject to the same standards. You know, it is. There's pre-registration for qualitative research. Just because you're doing post-diction instead of prediction doesn't mean you can't register what you're doing, what your plans are. Reduce subjectivity. Oh, but subjectivity is the whole point of you know, discourse analysis, of things like that. You can have flexibility in pre-registration. You can pre-register your subjectivity, right? And so it's not, they're not exempt from these reporting standards. The data, you can deposit the data, all of the transcripts. Well, what did people actually say? You know, it's about trustworthiness. You know, can we trust people to you know, transcribe what actually happened? But you know, we find in quantitative research we can't always trust people, so we'd like to see the data. We'd like to see the transcripts in an appendix, right? The APA has very clear standards now for qualitative, meta-analytic, mixed method research, how that should be reported. Codings, inter-rater reliability is often not happening. Themes that are extracted from the coding are not cohesive and not clear. There's many checklists on qualitative research that you can do to make sure that, you know, it's high quality. So, you know, unfortunately, we reject a lot of it, and people say, oh, you don't publish enough qualitative research. That's just because the standards are not catching on in a very similar way as with qualitative research. You know, and there are some areas we struggle with, you know, that admit auto-ethnographic research. You know, we don't know how to deal with certain types of qualitative research, and we're seeking, you know, advice and guidance on those things. Some of it we just don't publish because it doesn't fit with the journal, and that's the honest answer. And some of it we may in the future, and so we're keeping an open mind about that. And some of our editors have expertise in qualitative research, and so it's you know, it's definitely an option. So do submit your work. I hope this wasn't a negative sort of talk. I'm interested in more methodological work, meta-analyses, trends in the field, you know, assessments of our field. Love it. Would like to have more people reflect on that. Mixed methods, you know, more field work from non-weird countries. You know, we don't hear enough from other parts of the world, and combining best of both worlds. New areas, right? Environmental neuroscience, computational big data. We're also interested in you know, new kinds of work. So thank you for your attention, and I'd love to hear from you know, from people who joined this webinar if they have questions.
Great, thanks so much, Sander. So we've got about 10 minutes, and we've got a few questions that have popped in. So Sander, if you open up the Q&A box, you should be able to see some of those questions. We had one about qualitative research, which I think you answered already. And we've got some thank yous coming in. So Sander, if you can't see the questions, I'm happy to read them too, but can you see that list?
Yeah, you referred to our field. Environmental psychology is totally unclear. Planning program, interdisciplinary work. Yep, okay. So I'll tackle all of those quickly. I'm happy to. Yes, our journal is very interdisciplinary. I would say we get submissions from urban planners, architects, computer scientists, engineers, psychologists, everyone essentially, mathematicians. So we're super interdisciplinary, and I think that's a great thing about the journal. But we are a psychology journal at the end of the day, so there has to be some implications for psychology and standards in psychological research, which can be a bit of a challenge from people coming from other fields. But we do try to, you know, we have a submit your way thing that I think is great. I'm not enforcing reporting style on the first submission. I think it's a huge waste of time for authors to be dealing with this. But on the revision, you know, we do try to format according to APA style and other things. But you know, first submissions are relatively relatively flexible. Our field, I'm confused by environmental psychology. You know, so don't, you know, I think that's pretty universal. We have conservation psychology. We have geographical psychology. We have environmental psychology. And so, you know, I think environmental psychologist is the broadest of terms, and the way we've defined it is all human-environment interactions. So whenever there's a role of the environment in human behavior, that's, you know, that counts as environmental psychology. So it is very clear, but I do want to emphasize that a lot of submissions we get take the environment role very broadly constructed, and they're not inventing theories in environmental psychology, which is a problem for our journal. So we do have to engage with theories that are part of our field. Question about field work: is random selection can be problematic for field work? Absolutely. We appreciate field work. Many things go wrong. I do field work, very noisy, lots of things go wrong all the time. That's perfectly fine. Just report, just report it transparently, and then we can, quasi-experimental work is appreciated. You can assess the bias of non-randomization. So that's not a reason not to submit it, but I think we have to be transparent. So one of the things we've done as a journal is we've changed our reporting standards, and that's also in the online submission system. You have to acknowledge those now. And what's interesting is that many people acknowledge it, but then they don't actually do it, which I find very problematic. You have to report effect sizes everywhere. Cohen's d, eta squared, odds ratios, effect sizes have to be reported everywhere. 95% confidence intervals have to be reported everywhere. I think it's so important to bring uncertainty in the data to light. You have to visualize the raw data with uncertainty around the data. Try to do distributions and densities rather than just means. Power analysis, we talked about that. Reporting with and without exclusions. And so on. So we have a big list of things that we require now that have to be reported, rather than our subjective input of what makes a great article. I just want to make sure that they're replicable and robust, and leave it to the reader to decide what's interesting and what's not. I think those covered a lot from the Q&A. Is there, you want me to keep going through the Q&A, Ezra?
Go for it. We've got a few minutes left if you've got the energy for it. I think we've got questions around the process for pre-registration, tackling research for inherently small samples, neighborhood community-based research. You've touched on some of this.
Well enough from saying on other field and quantities do have to be examined. Pre-registration, as predicted is a popular framework. It's just one page. People think, oh, pre-registration. It's just one page with a few simple questions. You can also do it on the OSF. We're not restrictive. We welcome any kind of pre-registration. And exactly for the kind of questions that are being raised. I'm doing research in small communities, small ends. I think it's more important in those cases to register what you're doing and to lay out the plans beforehand. I'm not going to be able to gather as much data. This is the expected end. These are the expected analyses. I think it adds so much more value and credibility to the work if you have a pre-analysis plan when you know that your samples are going to be small and people are going to be scrutinizing that. So again, it's not a reason not to submit, but I think it helps to just do the groundwork of making sure that you're recording everything and that it's transparent to the editors and readers of why the samples are small and how it came about and all of that kind of stuff. Again, you can deposit data anywhere, OSF, Harvard, Verse, we're not restrictive. We have data and brief articles. I don't want to promote those because it's an Elsevier thing, but you can publish an article along with your regular article where you can deposit the data with a DOI, but you can do that anywhere. Seminal findings. It's a subjective criteria for replication, what's seminal, but I think, people use certain criteria. How often has it been cited? Is it influential in practice in the field? Is it used by people? When you make a submission and you think something is important, just make a case for why you think environmental psychology thinks this is important and people have been paying attention to it. And yes, replication means cross-cultural too. We're keen to get more cross-cultural work and cross-cultural generalizability of our findings.
Looks like we've got one last question we've got time for about open access and publishing fees.
Yeah, I'm trying to push Elsevier to be open access. They're a bit inflexible. One idea they floated is to create a mirror version of JAP that's going to be fully open access. And obviously won't have an impact factor, but it would be the same journal, but it's completely open access. I'm not sure where the plans are for that. I've nudged them to do other things like make our most read or downloaded articles open access. I realized that this is a problem, open access with Elsevier, and I'm already doing most of what I'm doing. They probably don't like, so they haven't fired me so far. But we're trying to push them as hard as we can in terms of getting on board with open science. They come back with excuses like, oh, the open access fee is $1,800. It's cheaper than +1. So what are people complaining about? It's cheaper than most open access journals. So, you know, we go back and forth, but they know they're going to have to change to an open access model when you look at the future of the publishing industry. So I think they know that. They're just trying to figure out how to get there. And, you know, in the meantime, we do what we can, but we're stuck with Elsevier, unfortunately.
Great. Thanks so much, Sander, for joining us. And to all of you, we had 50 people join today. Just a final note. So each of these webinars is recorded, so you can go back and listen to all of Sander's advice on how to get your work published at JP and what not to do. So as soon as those recordings will take a couple days for us to get posted, and everything will be starting to go up on the Division 34 website, which is pretty easy to find. And I hope many of you will join us in just 4 short weeks from now to hear from Sonia Sachdeva from the U.S. Forest Service. And thanks everybody for calling in today.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Great day. And thank you, Sander, again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Cheers, everyone.